There was an important summit today in London, meeting perhaps would be a better term, between Chinese Premier Li Keqiang and British Prime Minister David Cameron. The last time I remember this sort of summit was back in 2008 between Gordon Brown and Wen Jiabao, who were then in their respective roles. A lot of this press release that I've just seen was from the 10 Downing Street website was somewhat predictable, because with these sort of Western Chinese summits there's usually a lot of politeness, a lot of relatively vague language about mutual responsibility for a better world, that sort of thing. And this one was no exception. Although I would say it was slightly, apologies, just plugging in my computer. This one was slightly more, I guess you could say, personal than previous summits I've seen. What I meant by that was there was some sort of light-hearted moments which were similar to almost as if Cameron was meeting Obama or another Western leader. For example, Cameron thanked Premier Li for giving his daughter a toy panda. Premier Li spoke about it being a sunny day and wanting to travel outside London. So there was non-political things there which were clearly sort of diplomatic gestures of amicability. And that's sort of the routine in most diplomatic summits. So I want to speak a little bit about the summit and then my own stance on it. Firstly, the two countries, Britain and China, have agreed a £14 billion trade agreement. Britain certainly needs strong trade. Apologies, I need to plug this in properly. Apologies for that, I just didn't want to start the video again. Yeah, anyway, Britain is still a country recovering from austerity, and it's still a country that really does need to be pragmatic and look at the BRIC economies, because the BRIC economies, the BRIC nations, will definitely be the future. And Cameron was right to say that the 21st century, in the 21st century, the development of China is going to be an absolutely central focus. Maybe the central focus in the world economy. So no country can ignore China. Certainly not a powerful Western country that is looking to sustain recovery. So there's a lot of things to consider here. A lot of it, like I say, was vague language about a better world and mutual responsibility of the UN Security Council, although there was no mention of specific issues like Syria, Ukraine or Iraq, but obviously there was some overtones there. Premier Li pointed out that there will be 10,000 Chinese students will come to Britain in the future. I don't know if he meant next year, but I believe that was the figure. I'll put a clip to the exact video, so I apologise, I'm a little bit tired, so I may not be quoting word for word, but in return he also said that China would welcome more UK students. Now that's significant because at the moment the UK has 100,000 Chinese overseas students and there's only 5,000 British students in China. I'm not sure why that is not an equilibrium, whether it be that UK universities are more prestigious, or I don't know what it is. I don't know what the reason for that is. Premier Li also thanked essentially the Prime Minister for easing visa restrictions that had been a long-running issue with the Chinese, that our visa requirements were too complex. And I'd agree with that. I mean, when I worked in China, it was relatively simple, I have to say. Certainly simpler than I expected. But the sort of things that Chinese students have to do to come here is a lot more complicated. Now, I'm not sure what process British students have to go through to get to China, but I do think it's pragmatic to make the system simpler. It should be fair and it should be thorough, but it should be not unnecessarily complicated. And not just students, we're also looking at Chinese tourism and that sort of thing. We have something of a competition with Paris in this regard. I understand Paris right now is having a bit of a problem with a lot of thefts, specifically against Chinese tourists, and there's a controversy there over whether or not Chinese police should assist their French colleagues in dealing with this. It's a controversial issue, of course, because that's a sovereignty issue. So that's the issue that's going on in France. From my perspective, it seems that France is having stronger relations with India, and Britain has having stronger relations with China these days, which is interesting. The Cameron doctrine is pretty much one of being very, very pro-China. That has seemed to be the message over the last year. Now, looking at the comments below, there was a mixed response. Of course, most of them were British. I got this on Facebook. Most of them were British because, well, Facebook is banned in China, so the majority of comments there were British. There were roughly 50-50. Some of them were positive and praising Cameron's leadership, saying he was doing the right things for the country. However, someone did point out that this investment, this 14 billion deal, should be British jobs for British workers, so there would be no point if it was Chinese investment, but then it was just Chinese migrants came and take the jobs. So that's an issue, obviously. There was also inevitably a lot of comments about human rights, and this is an area I want to talk a bit on. Unfortunately, we can't talk about China without reflecting on that. I've made videos whereby I believe that China is certainly got a lot to answer for in terms of its past, including its recent past. It wasn't long ago I made a video on Tiananmen Square, and I stand by everything I say. We can never ever trivialize human rights, and I have to admit, last year when Cameron visited China, I felt somewhat uncomfortable. I believe that was the largest trade mission ever that a British Prime Minister undertook to China, maybe even to another country, I don't know. But one of the things that Cameron took over there in his doctrine was that Britain was going to make itself the most accessible Western country to China. Now, that's practical, it's logical. On the other hand, I am uncomfortable with the idea that we're going to completely sell out on our values and basically never mention human rights. I am very uncomfortable about that, because if there is ever a situation like there was in 1989, and it's not an inconceivable scenario, then we're going to look pretty foolish having basically sucked up to China in this way for so long. And then Cameron is going to be under pressure, of course, to condemn that, and that's the worst case scenario. Let's hope it doesn't happen, but there is certainly enough issues in China right now to make that scenario possible again. If you read Will Hutton's fantastic book on this subject, it shows that some of the conditions that are existing in present day China could well bring about that situation. So there's a lot to think about in terms of, you know, a lot of focus was on the Chinese economy, but you cannot just think about the Chinese economy. There has to be a focus on China's social and political issues as well, because for so long it was sort of a case of China was going forward economically, which was great, but there was almost no progress politically and socially. By socially, I mean in terms of issues like human rights. China's still got a long way to go. To its credit, there has been progressive moves. For example, the re-education camps have been closed down. That can only be a good thing. However, the brutal persecution of Falun Gong continues. The Chinese government continues to make excuses for that. There's still whitewashing of recent history. There's still a disgraceful way that dissidents are treated, peaceful dissidents. So there's a lot of issues regarding human rights that still need to be addressed. I honestly, in my core thinking, in my core instinct, I believe that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang are more progressive than their predecessors. In my core, I do believe that. So I'm relatively optimistic about the future. But that doesn't mean we can ever be complacent. And I am not comfortable with the idea that we need to sort of sell our soul as a nation in order to get investment from China. And you know, it's all very well having this nice sort of dialogue and, you know, sort of being very polite and talking about mutual responsibility in the world, all that's important. I'm not underestimating it. But in my opinion, we should never sell our values completely. Having said that, I don't quite go along with the idea that we should go in guns blazing and sort of lecture the Chinese, and then basically this is a two-way thing. And frankly, if we want to get out of austerity, if we want to be a major economic player in the modern world, we have to take the BRIC countries seriously. And it simply won't work if we go in there and lecture China, especially since we're not perfect ourselves. It's just not going to work that way. So it would be unfair to expect David Cameron to go in and just guns blazing, expect him to say, what you're doing is terrible, etc, etc, etc. Diplomacy is essential. Now, this isn't a case of allowing ourselves to be bullied by a country like China. It's a 50-50 thing, and we must never ever allow a situation where we're pushed around. However, some of the things that Premier Li said were encouraging. For example, he made the point, Chinese people here need to respect our laws and customs. And there has been many occasions I have felt that some Chinese, certainly not everyone, but some Chinese have very much disrespected this nation. No doubt the same thing can be said about some Britons in China. But I think what Premier Li was doing there was trying to be diplomatic and show that he is making efforts to make this a 50-50 thing. Now, China is a huge economy, but people forget it is still a developing country. So actually China does need Western countries. It's not simply a case that we need China. China actually does need Western countries as well. So we need each other. It's as simple as that. I love China as a country. I don't love the political system that's in power there. But I'm also a realist, and I recognise that in an interconnected world, we simply cannot ignore every regime that we don't like, that we don't agree with ideologically. It's simply not realistic. Where we can, I do think we should speak up, and we should never ever be slavish, ever, to any country, including to other Western countries like the United States. We're a sovereign country, we should never be slavish to anyone. But to go in there guns blazing, and sort of, Cameron can't sort of stand there and say, you need to sort of stop persecuting Falun Gong. I think that's more something that he could say privately. But in a press conference, diplomatic language is important because the world is watching, and it is important to send out the right message. Now, what I mean by that is, if you have a situation where Cameron looks like he's lecturing China, then China will just turn around and find something to lecture us about. So it's not going to work like that. And believe me, I am someone who passionately believes in human rights, but I don't think it would actually help Chinese dissidents to sort of boycott China or not do any deals with them. I don't think that would actually help dissidents anyway. So maybe my views have altered a bit on this. A few years ago I would have said, oh, we should never have any deals with them. But the fact is, it's not the real world. China is the world's second biggest economy, so it can't be ignored. However, it has weaknesses that it also needs to deal with. So this is a 50-50 thing. Premier Li is relatively new on the job. Cameron's now 4 years into the job. So, I imagine there's going to be a working partnership for some time to come. And it is absolutely critical that there's several things. Number one, sincerity, honesty. That means that we shouldn't sell our values. We should speak up on issues like human rights. But I don't think necessarily publicly. I think that's the sort of thing that David Cameron can and should do privately. But I don't think there's any merit in sort of humiliating the Chinese. I don't think that's going to serve any purpose. I think there's some areas we can also change our rhetoric. For example, there has been a number of terrorist attacks in China recently. Now we need to call those what they are. They're terrorist attacks. Whatever we think about situations in Xinjiang or Tibet, especially Xinjiang, when militants attack unarmed Chinese civilians, that is terrorism. So we shouldn't beat around the bush. We should be coming out and saying we condemn this and we will support the Chinese government against specific terrorism. Not a crackdown on all Uyghur people, but it's a mutual interest. Governments around the world have a mutual interest in taking on terrorism, especially that particular brand of terrorism, which is often based on Islamist ideology. But there's a lot of mutual things at stake here, and I just don't think that a militant approach is necessarily going to work. At the same time, I don't think we should ever be slavish or subservient. I felt when Cameron went to China, there was overtones there from Cameron's attitude that was a little bit subservient, and they didn't like it. But this meeting seemed a bit more 50-50. So I think we should be pragmatic. I want good relations with China, not because I like the particular government that's in power, but that's just the way it is, and it isn't going to change overnight. So we shouldn't be subservient, but we should be practical. And the simple reality is, the Communist Party is in power in China. We cannot simply blacklist them and not deal with them because we don't like that ideology. So that's my outlook on this. I do think in private David Cameron should be a statesman and make the courageous choices to not leave human rights off the table. I think that would be wrong. But he should do it in a diplomatic way whereby we're not sort of humiliating the Chinese or that we come across like we're lecturing. It's difficult. It is difficult to get the balance because human rights violations from my line of thinking it infuriates me. So, you know, I think people need to try and understand the pressure that David Cameron's under to get that balance right. The fact of the matter is, we do need to trade with a country like China because you cannot ignore the world's second biggest economy. That's the way it is.